Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage a scientist, a leader, and a true European visionary, Professor Maria Leptin.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Whoever came up with that text is a master of flattery. I can live up to some of these things. Curiosity, yes. Intellect, we'll see. Also, thank you to the BMW Foundation for the invitation and for all of you for hanging around here and sticking around for the last talk. Last week, on October 13th, Philippe Aghion, a longtime ERC grantee, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences together with Joël Mokyr and Peter Howard for having explained innovation-driven economic growth. Very relevant to the discussion today. For the ERC, it was another moment of pride. We've funded his research with 2 consecutive grants, and Aghion is now the 15th ERC grantee to have received the Nobel Prize. And the others included fields from ancient DNA, climate modeling, quantum information, etc. But this award also gives us an opportunity to think and reflect on the ideas that underpin not only Aghion's work, but European socio-economic model itself. Over the past couple of centuries, the world has seen an extraordinary transformation. During this time, we've seen sustained economic growth that compounds over time rather than the stagnation that defined much of human history before that. The 2025 Nobel Prize in Economic Science honors Joël Mokyr, Philippe Aghion, and Peter Howard for their complementary contributions towards explaining why this sustained growth became possible and under what conditions, and that's perhaps even more interesting for us, it can persist. More than 60 years ago, research by the economist Robert Solove highlighted the importance of innovation for growth. So that's an old idea, that growth requires innovation. But he was less concerned with how this generation can be generated. More recently, Paul Romer, another Nobel laureate in 2018, worked on the concept of ideas. And he said that ideas, unlike different economic outputs, have 3 critical qualities. First of all, they're non-rival. This means that unlike people or machines, for example, those that are tearing down the West Wing right now, they can't at least tear down other things. But unlike people or machines, ideas, if somebody uses an idea, it does not stop others from using that same idea. So ideas can be used by many people in parallel. Secondly, ideas are non-excludable. Once someone has come up with an idea, it's relatively easy for people to copy and use the idea. And finally, and this is important, ideas can be combined. So this idea of combination might initially sound trivial or obvious, but it's actually very important. Because with each new understanding we have, with each new idea we now have the possibility of combining that with all other knowledge that we already have. And that's what Romer described as, or defined as, combinatorial explosion. And it's driven the huge rise in living standards that, in his view, that we've seen over the last 2 centuries. It's very simple. The more knowledge we acquire, the more useful combinations we can make, and they become possible. And an example of this amazing power of combination are the lithography machines that are built by ASML, obviously the backbone of global semiconductor industry, and they've been described as the most complex machines ever built. Each one of these contains more than 100,000 parts, weighs 180 tons, and costs over 150 million. And there's probably a good reason why nobody else can manufacture them. And these machines, of course, bring together decades of research and development and a whole suite of technologies aligned to the tightest of tolerances in order to build this precision at the atomic scale that we need to make the chips. I often hear the argument, in fact, far too often, that taxpayer money should only be spent where economic returns are guaranteed. As a scientist, that's totally ununderstandable. Although, of course, for the taxpayer and for the politicians, and even for citizens like me, it sounds reasonable. But if we think about it for a moment, what does guaranteed return actually mean? In the world of science and innovation, the greatest impacts are often not guaranteed. They don't come from something that was guaranteed. They are highly contingent and totally unpredictable. ASML was a combination of Philips and ASM, who created a joint venture in 1984, at a time when they had no commercially viable products and huge losses, and there was no guarantee at all that they would one day grow into this global monopoly. And they didn't do this alone. They benefited greatly from decades of work by more than 30 organizations, including critical support from the public sector. It's, of course, tempting for policymakers to think of research and innovation as a smooth and predictable process. It's often described as a pipeline, and it's almost like a relay race where each runner perfectly hands the baton towards the next one, and they all work toward a clear, guaranteed goal. That's simply not how research and innovation work. It's more like a team sport, like a football game, which is chaotic. Certainly watching football is chaotic to me, even when the rest of the family understands it on TV. I don't. But it is, in fact, often unpredictable and messy, and even I understand that. So for all the brilliance and skill we see, players miss the goal, lose the ball. And in research and innovation, some projects simply end abruptly, going nowhere. Some ideas fail, appearing like wasted effort and resources. We scientists know that they're not wasted. They bring learning. But, you know, in isolation, many research efforts appear unsuccessful or incomplete or possibly even misguided. The RNA modifications that eventually led to the COVID vaccine were such an example. When Katalin Karikó worked on them 20 years ago, she was considered misguided. Another example is the lithium-ion battery. Obviously extremely important. Portable electronics, laptops, smartphones, and now cars, and probably energy storage. But to get to where we use lithium-ion batteries now was a totally tortuous long road. Many false starts, setbacks, failures, materials that didn't work, prototypes that couldn't be scaled, hugely expensive ventures that never made it off the drawing board. It took decades of research performed all around the world before a practical battery was possible. So it's not R&D. It's R&D and R&D and R&D, and eventually something may come out. Nothing linear about that. The other thing is that research and innovation are therefore collective efforts. And the job of policymakers is not to demand immediate success from every attempt, but rather to support and encourage the entire messy, dynamic, collaborative process. The prize for Murcia, Aghion, and Hewitt right now reminds us again that new ideas power long-run prosperity to the churn of creative destruction. That's not their term, it goes back further, but So half of the prize went to Mokyr for identifying the prerequisites for sustained growth through technological process, and the other half went jointly to Aghion and Howitt for the theory of sustained growth via creative destruction. And their work shows that science and new ideas aren't nice-to-haves. They show they are the engine room of growth, and that's partly why Philippe Aghion is a huge supporter of the ERC. He understands that the kind of blue sky fundamental research researcher-driven ideas are what fuels growth and innovation. But Mokyr describes how when you combine knowledge of how the world works, and he calls this propositional knowledge, with the knowledge of how to build things that work, what he calls prescriptive knowledge, you get compounding progress. Our society escaped historical stagnation when they learned to institutionalize that links between science and application, and to protect the messy but fruitful processes of continual replacement that follows. Aghion and Howitt put the formal structure under this story in 1992. And their story also shows the power of collaboration, which is so important for scientific progress. Their insight, derived from Schumpeter, who I believe created the term creative destruction, was that economies advance when entrepreneurs invest in R&D to leapfrog others, earn temporary rents, and then get leapfrogged in turn. This doesn't just create new products, it reallocates resources, reshapes firms, and yes, it does destroy jobs and business models. That's the destructive part. And that's why Aghion subsequently spent much of his career trying to work out how you get the upside of dynamism while containing and reducing the downside of disruption. He argues that fostering innovation is all about balance. Innovation thrives with competition. Science research thrives with competition, but too much competition can diminish the rewards of new technologies, businesses, and ideas. International competition can stimulate innovation and efficiency, but too much competition risks provoking a backlash against globalization. And we heard this about the context of Europe. This morning, Catherine was very vocal about that competing is not the point. We've come to a point where competing is counterproductive. For Aghion, growth lasts when you, 1, design rules that fund the upstream science that feeds the pipeline, 2, let new entrants challenge the incumbents, he calls that competition policy, and 3, ensure people against the shocks of change, and that's where we in Europe are very timid. And if you ensure all those 3, then the creative destruction becomes socially and politically tolerable. So sustained growth is not automatic. It relies on institutions that keep the innovation engine turning and keep society confident enough to accept change. It's probably no coincidence that Aghion's preferred model sounds a lot like the European model. We in Europe, at our best, try to make structural change politically sustainable and unpainful. We invest public money in upstream scientists at arm's length, including ERC-style excellence funding, of which our American colleagues are very envious. We use competition authorities to keep markets contestable, and the European model relies on social insurance so that workers aren't asked to carry all the risk of transformation. Does that mean that we in Europe have hit on the ideal model, which can serve as a global model for sustainable development for other geopolitical blocs around the world? Not from what we're hearing from our politicians. But I guess in the real world, there are no perfect models, only trade-offs. And Europe isn't the only model for marrying ideas and growth. Of course, we're constantly looking at the US and China. The US model leans harder into scale and speed. We've also heard that this morning. Deep capital markets and very large domestic demand compared to the small national demands here in Europe. We are not a continent. We're 27 nations. Actually, we're more. We keep only talking about the EU. We'll get back to that in a moment. So they have a very large domestic demand, which makes it easier for them to finance risky bets, absorb failures, and scale winners quickly. The upside is, of course, visible in the number of frontier tech firms and platforms there. The downside is that you must constantly guard against emerging monopolies, some of which are very dangerous, whose dominance could strangle also the next wave. And the Chinese model, the other one that our politicians like to compare us to, we've seen that they've excelled at coordinated catch-up, levering their latecomer advantage, state-steered investment, huge internal market to adopt and adapt and scale at amazing speed. The downside of this model is, as you approach the frontier, the system must keep making room for bottom-up experimentation and the replacement of incumbents. But we're seeing that they've cottoned onto that too. But is China's leadership willing to allow the necessary creative destruction? Aguillon herself has been part of the debate of whether long-term innovation requires democracy and liberal institutions to prosper. So where does that leave us? There are strengths and weaknesses of the current models, and I don't think that anyone believes Europe gets everything right. Draghi's report offers critical insights, and he's actually made them even stronger. He's become even more vociferous about the need for change. He argues unambiguously for stepping up Europe's capacity to invest together as a continent, not as individual countries. And I would say we can't even say 27. We can't function without having UK and Switzerland and the other countries that are not part of the EU being part of our team. So we argue for stepping up Europe's capacity to invest together in true European public goods, breakthrough innovation, cross-border grids, other continental scale projects, and of course defense-related capabilities. And these have to be underpinned by common or joint funding where national action undersupplies them. In Draghi's framing, competitiveness now requires both better rules and more firepower. So in conclusion, Europe's future position in the world won't come from choosing between growth, cohesion, innovation, and democracy. It'll come from designing institutions that make those four, again, cohesion, growth, innovation, and democracy, reinforce each other at speed and at scale. The 2025 Nobel tells us that ideas compound when societies let them. Draghi tells us the politics must now catch up with theory by investing together by the European public goods that set the power of new ideas free. And I think Alexander De Croo and many others this morning made it clear that it's for all of our countries together to face that challenge. Thank you.